to the next slide and just briefly look at the literary context of Genesis 1. And I think that Brian did a fine job last week kind of setting that up, so I don't want to say much here, except that, of course, this comes at the beginning, right? And so we've got primeval history, Genesis 1 through 11, and our passage, chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 3, is basically scene 1 of Act 1 of the whole story. And the story, the setting is Moses is at the base of Mount Sinai. Israel has just come out of years of slavery, and God is establishing the Israelites to be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. And that's the context, literally, as well as historically. Let's go to the next slide, though. And I just want to give you a little bit more about the geography, the history, and the religions of this region, because it actually will help as we understand what's going on in Genesis chapter 1. So a little bit about the geography. So you might find this interesting. The world of the Old Testament is a world that's remarkably small, actually. Almost all of the action takes place in what we would today call the Middle East, and what historians call the ancient Near East. And so basically, it's an area that includes both northern parts of Africa, so think Egypt, all the way to Israel and the surrounding areas within Israel, what we would today call modern Iraq. And so that's basically where most of the Old Testament takes place. All of it is a very small piece of land, geographically speaking. When it comes to history, it's important to understand that there were two cultures that shaped the region here, both of which existed for over 2,000 years before Israel even became a nation. So you have on the east, you have Egypt, and then and then you have on the other side, you have Mesopotamia. And these are two cultures that are over 2,000 years old. And it's important to remember that all of the motifs, many of the motifs that we find in Genesis 1 through 11, this primeval history, are motifs that were inherited from these most ancient neighbors of Israel. And then finally, let me say a little bit about the religions and the sort of cultural backdrop that shaped the ancient Near East. So when it comes to Genesis, like I said, Moses is directly writing against his peers and their cultural and religious myths, especially what they thought in terms of the nature of the gods and the origin of the universe and the origin of humans as well. And in almost all cases, as we will see, and I want to kind of unpack some of this as we go, Moses was directly contradicting the popular opinions of the gods and the world that were held in his day. Okay, so there's a setup, at least just a little bit of setup. So let's go to the text. And so what I want to do is I want to begin by making some observations about God. And to do that, let's go to the next slide. What you find are 4 action verbs. God does 4 things in Genesis 1, and in listing and looking at these 4 things that he does, we're actually going to learn at least 9 things about who God is, okay? So let's start with the first one. Actually, we see God doing 4 things. He's creating and cultivating. Here's the 4. Creating and cultivating. He's naming, he's delighting, and he's resting, okay? And we want to look at these 4 actions that God is doing, and then we want to say, what do we learn about God as we think about these 4 actions? But we're going to begin with the first one. God is creating and cultivating. All right, so let's look at the bookends of our passage. In verse 1 of Genesis 1, we read, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Then we get to Genesis chapter 2 and look at verse 1 again. "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them." I love how the NIV reads this passage. It says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array." So the first activity we see God doing is creating, right? And he begins his creative work in verse 1 of chapter 1, and by the time we arrive at chapter 2, verse 1, God is, at the end of day 6, God's creative activity is finished. The heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. As Brian mentioned, we have this interesting Hebrew word that's used only of God when it comes to creation. It's actually the Hebrew word bara, B-A-R-A, and it's a word that's used 4 times in our passage. It's used in verse 1, Genesis 1:1, "In the beginning God created," that's bara. It's also used in verse 21 for God's creation of the sea creatures, the first life, and also it's used 3 times in verse 27 for God's creation of humans. And the idea is that God alone creates, and then in the context of Genesis 1:1, the verb implicitly points to God creating the universe out of nothing. Okay? So let's look again at verse 1. I know that Brian spent some time here, so I don't want to do a lot, but I do want us just to realize and to notice. In verse 1, we have God existing alone, prior to the beginning, it was God and nothing else, right? And then God brings in, by his will and his word, the heavens and the earth into being. And this phrase, the heavens and the earth, points to the totality of all things distinct from God. Every distinct, contingent, material reality comes into being out of nothing in virtue of God's creative activity. And as Brian mentioned last week, this is actually a real interesting difference that we see. Like when we make an omelet, or when I make an omelet, I do that out of materials that are pre-existing. So you have an egg, and you have vegetables, and you have cheese. When we make a bridge, we do that out of existing concrete and cables and other materials. When we create, we always create using things that already exist. But when God creates in Genesis 1, verse 1, he brings the universe into being out of nothing. Okay, so verse 1 is the absolute beginning of the universe. But then in verse 2, the focus shifts considerably from the material universe down to the earth. And we read initially in verse 2 that the earth was without form and void. Or as the NIV puts it, the earth was formless and empty. And it's that funny, kind of cool phrase that Brian mentioned last week, tahu and bahu. And it's a phrase that actually gives us the literary structure, though, of the rest of our passage. So if we go to the next slide, you can actually see the literary structure. So we have day 2, the earth is without form and void. And then as Genesis 1 continues, what we find in God's creative activity and cultivating activity, we see him giving shape and to the habitat and then inhabiting the habitat, okay? And we see 4 other words that are used to describe God's creating and cultivating activity. We see him speaking, we see him separating, we see him making and filling. All 4 of those words are words that further describe his creative and cultivating activity. So let's actually look at each of those 4 words too. So let's think about speaking. Genesis 1, there's this rhythm, there's this poetic cadence that you begin to see, and it begins this way in verse 3. It says, and God said, let there be, and then you see it move to the proclamation, and there was, and it ends with the conclusion, and God saw that it was good. You see this poetic cadence each of the first 6 days. And God said, let it be, and there was, and it was good. So God speaks reality into being. But then we see God separating. So in day 1 there, in verses 3 and 4, God creates light, separating day from night. So look at verse 3 and 4. It said, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated light from the darkness. And then in day 2, in verses 6 and 7, God creates the expanse. This is an interesting word. Sometimes it's translated firmament, sometimes hard dome, sometimes canopy, sometimes vault, depends on the translation. But basically, God separates the waters above the expanse from the waters below the expanse. So look at verses 6 and 7. And God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. Okay, that's day 2. Then we get to day 3 in verse 9, and God separates the land from the sea. Look at verse 9. And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry lands appear. And it was so. So in creating, we see God speaking all reality into existence out of nothing in verse 1. And then in days 1 through 3, God separates light from darkness, water from water, and water from land. And then we have in days 4 through 6, God's creative activity is portrayed often in terms of making and filling. So God creates the habitat, and now he inhabits the habitat with creatures. And we see many parallelisms between days 1 and 4, 2 and 5, and 3 and 6. So for example, day 1's creation of light parallels day 4's creation of the sun, moon, and the stars in verses 14 through 19. Day 2's separation of the sky from the water parallels day 5's creation of birds and sea creatures in verses 20 to 23. And then day 3's separation of the land and the sea parallels day 6's creation of land animals and humans in verses 24 to 31. And we'll spend a lot of time, we'll focus on that piece of the passage next week. So God creates and cultivates a habitat and fills the habitat with inhabitants. Okay, so what can we learn just from God's creative and cultivating activity? Well, as it turns out, we can learn a great bit. So let's go to the next slide. We actually learn at least 7 things just from God's creative activity. First, we learn that God is one, right? Moses is writing against a backdrop of polytheism and a polytheistic society, but it's notable that Moses makes no mention of any other gods. They're just Elohim. They're just the one God. Second, God is eternal. Again, prior to the beginning was God and God alone. God is self-existent. God is everlasting. God doesn't begin to exist, and God won't cease to exist. And that's what it means to be eternal. By contrast, the universe comes into being at the moment of creation, as you see in Genesis 1. Third, God is sovereign and powerful. Again, in contrast to the ancient Near Eastern gods that fashioned the universe out of pre-existing materials, God brings the universe into being out of nothing whatsoever. Moreover, God is Lord or sovereign over the waters and the sun and the moon and the stars. And all of those objects in the ancient Near East were thought of as divine and uncontrollable kinds of beings. They were worshipped. So God is sovereign and powerful. Fourth, this means that God is also free. He's not constrained by material. He's not constrained by the other gods. He's free to create or not to create. He's free to create this world or some other world. God is completely free. Number 5, God is rational. We find God ordering and delineating, separating and making and filling. The universe that began in verse 2 in a state of chaos is now described as something that God is bringing into order. What is this, 6? Generous. God is generous. He creates a place for humans to inhabit, and he provides a plenitude of beings and for us to enjoy and to find sustenance. And then finally, you might wonder about this last one. Like, do we actually see the triunity of God in Genesis 1? And I think the answer here, especially when you read Genesis 1 in light of the rest of Scripture, I think there is a way to see, kind of like in an inchoate form, the Trinity in Genesis 1. So, for example, in verse 1, in the beginning God, you could view that as God the Father. You go to verse 2, you see the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. And then as you go to verse 3, God's Word speaks reality into being. You see the Logos, the Word of God. So I do think even in a kind of inchoate way, and especially if you read back from the rest of Scripture, you can see the triunity of God as well in Genesis 1. All right, let's move on. So that's just the first activity. Let's go to the second one. This one's really important, naming. And I want to bring this one out because of what I want to talk to you about next week, actually. So I want to notice some things here. But there's really something important here. In the midst of his creative activity, as God is bringing things into existence, as he's separating and making and filling, you also find God naming 5 things that form the backdrop of human life on earth. So look at verse 5. After separating light from darkness, we read, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Next, on day 2, after separating the waters below from the waters above, God calls the expanse of the firmament the sky, as we read in verse 8. And finally, on day 3, after separating the water from the land, God names the different regions of the earth in verse 10. God called the dry land earth. I think actually the NIV is a better translation. He calls it the land, right? It's just the land. And the waters that were gathered together, he calls the seas. Okay, so God names 5 great cosmic realities here that govern human existence: day and night, sky, land, and sea. Now, why does this matter? And here's the answer. To name something or some place is not only to know something about that thing, but is also to position oneself with respect to the thing named in a special way. So in the ancient Near East, when a king named a person or object, it was basically the king proclaiming dominion over that person or thing. And so by God naming these 5 cosmic realities, it actually signifies 2 things. God, as the source of these realities, knows them as they really are, right? So as philosophers, we would say God knows their essence, their purpose. And secondly, though, God is Lord over them. And again, in the ancient Near East context, remember that Moses is writing against all 5 of these realities were viewed as, for sure, hard to understand and often worshipped as primeval deities. And God is saying, again, against these pagan myths, that he knows these realities and he rules these realities, okay? So again, we see through God's naming activities, the oneness, the sovereignty, the power, the rationality of God. All right, let's go to this next slide, and let's go to the third thing, delighting. So God creates and cultivates, God names. God delights. So back to that rhythmic cadence that you find in Genesis 1. And God said, and it was so, and God saw that it was good. There's the word, 7 times. At the conclusion of each day, actually day 3 gets 2, it was goods. We have that God surveying of his work and proclaiming it good, and then in verse 31, proclaiming it very good. Now, why do I say here that this is God delighting? You might wonder, that might seem odd. But the first thing I want you to notice is verse 31. It says, and God beheld. God beheld that which he has made. So what Moses is inviting us to do here is to view the creation week from God's perspective. God beholds creation and dubs it good. He delights in his creation. And actually, you find further kind of evidence for that this is a moment of God delighting when you think about what delight is. So delight is an emotion. And this is actually something philosophers spend time working on. Like, what is an emotion and how do they function? And I'll just give you like a hypothetical to kind of understand. Suppose, purely hypothetically, is Ethel still here? She is here. That Ethel is angry at me, this is hypothetical, for spending too much time sitting in front of the TV at night instead of spending time with her. And suppose that her anger is justified because let's just say that watching too much TV, which is something of questionable value, is for me to neglect something of great value, such as Ethel and our marriage. Now notice Ethel's experience of that emotion, if there were this hypothetical, would reveal something about her and me and the perceived value, or in this case, disvalue of our situation. And that's what emotions do. They're actually they're ways that we perceive the value of a situation that we find ourselves in, right? That's what emotions are. And so delight is perceiving the goodness and the beauty of something when we do it. So when God beholds all that he has made and proclaims it good, he's perceiving the value of creation, and he's delighting. When we consider God's delight for that which he has made, we learn 2 additional things. Let's go to the next slide. We learn that he's good, right? So God is good, and out of that goodness, which bubbles up, he creates good things, these valuable things. But we also learn that God is creative. Like you might think about, he's not just, we talk about God making things, but God makes things, he's like the artist, the total original artist, right? He makes playfully, and he makes beautifully. In fact, this word good in the Hebrew is tov, T-O-V, and it's often also translated beautiful. So good and beautiful things. This is what God has made. Okay, so we see God delighting. Let's go to the last verb here. Next slide, God is resting. We've got to kind of complete this. So look at the end of our passage, chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. On the 7th day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. So the immediate question you might ask here is like, why did he rest? Was God exhausted? Was he tired? Did he need a break? Kind of like we do when we do work? And of course, that wouldn't be right. That's not why he rested. But he rested because it was complete. In fact, 7, the 7th day, is the Hebrew number symbolic of fullness or perfection or completeness. So what began in verse 2 of chapter 1 as formless and empty is now a world full of deep order and beauty and abundant. It's complete. It's very good. And so God rested. I love what the Duke University theologian Norman Wurzba suggests here as like the best analogy to understand why God rested when his creative work was done. And he said, think about it with the analogy of like creative humans, when we do creative work as humans. So when a painter or composer or a writer finishes a painting or a song or a story, the artist doesn't just walk away from his or her creation the moment it's done. Instead, they seek to fully come into the presence of that piece of art that's created and explore its contours and its depth and to contemplate its beauties and its profundities and its playfulness and its meaning. As Wurzba put it, he says they want to enter into their creation so that they can admire and enjoy its many features. And this is what's going on at the end of Genesis, in our passage, Genesis 2, in verses 2 and 3. God is resting, and it's key to his experience of divine delight in that which he has made. Let's go to the next slide. I love this quote from Norman Wurzba in his book, This Sacred Life. He says, when God looks out onto the first Sabbath, sunrise, what God perceives is divine love, variously made visible, tactile, fragrant, auditory, and delectable. In other words, a lavish and hospitable scene that inspires enjoyment and delight. So, 4 actions of God. God creates, names, delights, and rests, and at least 9 things that we learn from this passage about who God is. God is one, he's eternal, sovereign and powerful, free, rational, generous, good, creative, and triune. That's pretty cool. That's just, okay, we spent a lot of time on that. We better keep going here. That's just our first observation. Let's go to the second one. Well, I promise I'll move quicker. What does Genesis 1 teach us about, not just God, but about the world that we have made? I'm just going to give you, and I'm going to list them 5 things. Sorry, there's just so much in this passage. So let's go to the next slide. And actually, each slide will be a different thing that we learn about the world that God has made. And the first is one that we've already seen. All that God made is good and beautiful. 7 times in Genesis 1, we read that he saw that which was made, and it was good. And again, good and beautiful. Now, remember, this word ascribes value to things. And what that tells us is that everything created by God has value. Everything is valuable, and this will be relevant to what I want to talk to you about tonight when we talk about creation care and climate science. Secondly, let's go to the next slide. We learn that the world is well ordered, and everything fits together in the right way. So what's interesting, if you're following that passage, you actually see the phrase 10 times, according to their kinds, in Genesis 1. Creatures are created according to their kind. Humans are created according to the divine kind. Everything has a nature, a kindness, an essence of what it is, and that essence determines how it flourishes or how it obtains happiness. What you see here with this orderliness of the world, by the way, it helps us to see that while Genesis isn't a science textbook itself, it does lay a foundation for science. The world is orderly. The world is knowable. The world is rational and discoverable. Okay? Third, the creatures of this world are entangled and interdependent. Not only does everything fit together in a well-ordered way, but all the creatures are interdependent and entangled. Let me just show you a few things. Verse 29, God gives humans every plant for food, and he does the same for the animals in verse 30. And then, if you flip to verse 11 at the end of day 3 and verse 24 at the beginning of day 6, you see this curious phrase, let the land produce. First in verse 11, vegetation, and then in verse 24, living creatures. And the idea is that creatures are dependent and interdependent on the land and the sea and the sky and each other for their life and breath and flourishing. And again, this will be important as we talk tonight about creation care. Let's go to the fourth thing. Actually, skip down one more slide, Lisa, to number 4. And we've got the creatures of this world are embodied material beings. Now, this is important just for us to note that God created a material world. There's sometimes in evangelical circles we tend to focus on the spiritual, that we are souls that have bodies, but we do have bodies. We do have a material reality to us. And it's important to know that this is part of God's good creation that he has made. And so we need to affirm that matter is not inherently evil. It's part of the good world that God has made. And then lastly, the fifth thing that we can learn, if you go to the next slide, Lisa, all reality functions to point back to and reveal God. Now, we already know this, I think, because of passages like Psalm 19, where David proclaims that the heavens reveal the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. We know this because of passages like Romans 1:20, where Paul talks about how that which God has made reveals that he exists and his nature, his eternal nature and his divine power. But we can actually see that same principle at work in Genesis chapter 1. And actually what's interesting about it, the key is to notice the word found at the exact middle of the passage. So again, our passage is chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 3. If you go to the exact middle of this passage, you find verse 14. And at the middle of the entire passage, you have this phrase in verse 14 where we're talking about God placing the sun, the moon, and the stars, and you have this purpose clause. They're placed in the heavens to be a sign, or as the NIV says, to mark the sacred times. And what we find here is what's called the semiotic function of creation. So semiotics is just the study of signs. So what do the material realities in this world point to? Well, they point to heavenly realities. Everything here points to and reminds us of the goodness of God. Okay? All right. Let's move lastly, and then we can wrap this up, to the last observation. What do we learn from Genesis 1 about God's purpose for creating? And, philosophers, we love to ask the why question. One interesting question is, why did God create? Like, what was God's actual reason? And we begin to see some of that unfold here in Genesis 1. So even just to review where we've been so far, we learn that God creates the material universe out of nothing, and as part of his creative activity, he wills and speaks, he separates and delineates, he orders and defines, he makes and he fills this world with deep beauty and order and abundance. So what you find is God creating a place, and then he creates a people, and then he gives those people a purpose. And we're going to talk more about the people and the purpose next week, but for now, I think that there's something that we can see that will be helpful. And it's actually in Genesis 1 here. One thing that we should notice is at the end of each of God's work days, you have this phrase. So it begins with, and God said, but it always ends with this phrase, and there was evening, and there was morning, the nth day, for whatever day 1 through 6. The seventh day is different, however. God doesn't say anything, and he doesn't do anything. He's resting. And that refrain, and it was evening and it was morning, the nth day is missing. And that suggests that God's rest is ongoing, and day 7 is ongoing in a way that's distinct from how days 1 through 6 have now passed. But one thing I want us to notice, though, is the curious ordering of that refrain at the end of each day, right? Why is it that evening is followed by morning? We might think more naturally it's usually the morning followed by evening. And the answer is because for the Hebrews, what was in between evening and morning was the most important thing. And what was that? It was the night. And why was the night important? Well, that was because that was when they rested. Let me just read you one psalm, Psalm 104, verse 23. It says, man goes out to his work and his labor until the evening. So the daily rest in Israel looks forward to the weekly Sabbath rest. And the idea here is that the creation week is an analogy for us to understand how we are to live and move and have our being in God's good world. For 6 days, like God's work days, we are to work, and on the seventh, like God, we are to rest. Now, the invitation to rest, daily and weekly, is an invitation to remind ourselves, and here's where we get to this purpose clause, to remind ourselves that the core of our identity is not found in what we do. Right? In fact, it's found in the fact that we are loved by God. As many commentators put it, that we're human beings before we're human doings, right? And if you recall the context of our passage, this literary context and historical context, Moses was writing this at the base of Mount Sinai, after leading the Israelites out of Egypt for hundreds of years, where they had been enslaved, working 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And they existed all those years for one reason, to work. And their value was measured in terms of bricks. If they produced enough bricks each day, they could live to do the same the next day, but they never rested. God's design is different. He wants to remind us that our primary calling is to rest in God's love. And then out of that rest, both each day, or I should say each night, and each week, we work, but not the other way around. Okay, so let's see if we can wrap some things up here. Let's go to the next slide. Why does all this matter? Okay? I think, why does it matter that we learn things about God from Genesis 1? Why does it matter that we learn things about God, the world that God has made? And then why does it matter that we learn something about God's purpose through Genesis 1? Let's start with the first one. Why does our idea of God matter? And I'm always struck by this sentence, which is the first sentence in that book by A.W. Tozer. The book's called The Knowledge of the Holy. But in there he says, what comes to mind when we think about God is the most important thing about us. And that strikes me and has always struck me as a profoundly true sentence. But what's interesting, if you read the rest of his chapter, he goes on to trace all the ills of modern man, and therefore the modern church, to a defective idea of God. He says, before the Christian church goes into eclipse anywhere, there must first be a corrupting of our simple, basic theology. She simply gets a wrong answer to the question, what is God like, and goes on from there. our idea of God matters a great deal. And we don't have time because I'm probably already over, but we worship that which is ultimate, number one. Number two, we know best we love best what we know best. And happiness, as it turns out, is relationship with God. So if we want to actually be happy in the objective sense, if we want to flourish the way God made us, then we need to know and be united with the God who is and the God that actually exists. All right, let's go to the next slide. Why does it matter that we understand the world that we find ourselves in? And I think what I want to say here, just briefly, is that we can't actually see and delight in the world that God has made properly unless we understand it. And we can't understand it, and we can't cherish it, and we can't care for it unless we understand it. And so to see and to delight and then to care for the world that God has made, we need to understand a little bit about how the world that God has made. And remember, Genesis teaches us that the goodness of creation includes things like finitude and contingency and dependency. And it reminds us that we have limits, that we don't have to be like extraordinary Christians. It's good enough just to be ordinary, right? It's good enough to live within our limits. And I think that that's partly what we learn when we learn about the world that we find ourselves in. And then lastly, and I will conclude with this, why does it matter that we learn a little bit? Let's go to the next slide. Why does it matter that we learn about our purpose? And the answer is because it reminds us that rest, or happiness, to use the proper word, is possible. And it's found in God. So I love, this is some of my favorite words from a favorite book called The Confessions, written by St. Augustine. But this is the last sentence of the first paragraph of that great work. But just look at the last part of that. He says, right here, he says, "You stir man to take pleasure in praising you because you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find rest in you." And so Genesis 1 actually reminds us and invites us to find peace. Peace from the battles that rage outside, and peace from the battles that rage within us, right? Do you want to find rest? Do you struggle to feel like you've not achieved enough or that you have enough? Well, Genesis 1 reminds us that we are lovingly created and sustained and cared for by God, a God who invites us to daily enter his rest and delight in him and delight with him in all that he has made. Let's pray.